Welcome to the first in a series of videos about the fourth economy. You are, right now, living in one of the biggest economic shifts in history. How big? Well, the first three times that this pattern played out, it gave us the agricultural, the industrial, and information economies. That's huge. My prediction is that the next economy is going to be an entrepreneurial economy. There's so many implications to that. Some are sort of straightforward. They suggest, for instance, that we need to better understand and imitate the dynamic we've seen in places like Silicon Valley, with the interplay between the venture capital and tech industries there. And that, of course, is non-trivial. But there are other implications that are even less obvious, and perhaps the chief one is what I want to talk about now. It's the idea that social invention is as important to economic progress as is technological invention. And I'd say that entrepreneurship is a form of social invention. But first, let me share a couple of stories to illustrate what I mean by social invention. A story about Edison and a story about Britain's patent law. Because this notion of social invention is central to understanding the pattern of progress that not only gave us the first three economies, but will do so much to define the fourth entrepreneurial economy. I'm going to start with Thomas Edison. Now, Edison is an iconic American figure, and rightfully so. The man invented 1,093 different things, or at least has that many patents. So think about that. That's like 1,093 more patents than the average person. Now, if I shared a list of some of his major inventions, you'd probably have trouble deciding which was most impressive. The light bulb. Now, that was not just a great product, but it came to symbolize breakthrough thinking. And that alone was really a system that required devices like the first electrical on-off switch. Itself a fairly ubiquitous device, one I would brag about having invented. I mean, could you imagine people looking at you and saying, "Oh, there goes the guy who invented the on-off switch." And that was just one component of one of his inventions. He made a phonograph, something that let people listen to recorded rather than just live music. He invented the first motion picture projector. Now, we've improved on his original idea, but that too seems to have caught on. Fewer people know that among his other many inventions, he came up with the idea of the electric car. He had this crazy notion that that might be better than a gasoline-powered car. Now, I could go on with his different inventions, but here's the punchline. Out of all of these impressive inventions, I would argue the most impressive wasn't technological. It was a social invention. Because most of these technological inventions came after this incredible social invention. Edison founded, you could use the term I would, that he invented, America's first industrial research and development lab. For the first time in this country, people were hired to invent things, to make new products. And while Edison was undoubtedly a genius, he also did a terrible job of sharing credit with his employees. Those 1,093 patents, some unknown percentage were fully, or at least partly, developed by his employees. So to say Edison had 1,093 patents is a little bit like saying IBM's CEO had thousands of patents last year. But what he invented with that R&D lab, that was at least as transformative, I would say, as a light bulb or motion picture projector. There were innovations, there were breakthroughs before Edison came up with this idea of an R&D lab. But once other companies began to imitate this R&D lab notion, something really peculiar and incredibly transformative happened. Technological invention became institutionalized. Didn't just happen on rare occasion, it became the new norm. So today, we expect companies are going to regularly release the new generation of computer chip, or a new drug, or smartphone, or software, or a new kind of car, or kitchen appliance. Innovation has become normal, something that just happens all the time now. Innovation is normal compared with all of previous history. That is incredibly abnormal. It's worth remembering when you think about what changes we might face, that just because you haven't known anything different doesn't mean that there hasn't been something different in the past, and there won't be something very different in the future. So Edison invents the R&D lab, and that in turn becomes a greenhouse for a series of technological inventions. But this is by no means the only time in history that social inventions were catalysts to technological inventions. So the story of Edison is something that happened at a company level. I'm going to pull out and look at a country level. In 1623, Britain passes what we now call patent law. And for the first time in history, what they did was they said, if you invent something new, you get monopoly rights for it, at least for a time. Now, that time and those monopoly rights were promising enough that this was alluring to lots of inventors. Lots of folks started breaking away into labs, getting support from investors and bankers to come up with new ideas. And they were trying to develop something promising, something they could get a return on. 1623, Britain passes this legislation that invents patent law. And 1699, within the century, Britain had one of the most transformative technological inventions in the history of the world. They got the steam engine. Now, how transformative was the steam engine? Well, think about that. Before the steam engine, the only source of power you ever had was human or animal muscle or wind or water from wheels that picked up things off rivers. It was all just natural power, very limited. So what kind of difference did it make to suddenly have a steam engine that you could continue to improve and make more powerful? Well, for the first time in 6,000 years, from about the time of Homer before up to the time of Shakespeare, first time in 6,000 years, incomes begin to rise. That was just huge. Now, they've gone through various kind of evolutions the steam engine did, but it's hard to think of any technology that did more to bring us into the industrial economy. So you can ask whether or not we would have had a steam engine without the social invention of patent law, and it's possible. It's very possible. But I'll just point out that before there was patent law, any inventions depended upon the curiosity, the resourcefulness, and the altruism of some eccentric aristocrat who had the means to tinker. And you can just look at the data. That system didn't lead to much invention. So a country passes legislation for patent law, and then within the century gets a plethora of inventions that are so great it helps to trigger an industrial revolution. That was so cool, amazing, just transformative. And then we have the example of Edison. Here, a company sets up policies to stimulate invention, and again, a plethora of inventions. Social invention leads to technological invention. Now, how good have we gotten at Edison's model? IBM in 2010 became the first company in the history of the world to win more than 5,000 patents in a single year. In Edison's entire life, his Menlo Park R&D lab won over 1,000 patents, and now IBM does more than that in a single year. I think it's safe to say that we in the West have figured out technological invention. But notice something about our story. Examples of social invention in the past few centuries are about as rare as examples of technological invention in the centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution. At best, we encourage social invention at the level of the nation state. Rarely do we encourage social invention within organizations. But when it comes to social invention, we're closer to the point of Britain at the dawn of the industrial economy than we are to Edison at the dawn of the information economy. So, what's the difference between technological invention and social invention? Because again, this concept of social invention is crucial to understanding why we've made such enormous progress in that past and what I believe is going to happen here in the near future. Now, I'd say that technological invention creates some new system for parts that lets them do jointly what they could not do on their own. So a car, for instance, can take you from one place to the next, but its parts can't do that. By themselves, an engine, wheels, a seat, a steering wheel, they can't take you anywhere. So social invention is the same thing, but instead of parts, it's people. A social invention creates a new system that lets people do jointly what they couldn't do on their own. So a bank, for instance, it matches money from people who have more than they need now with people who have less than they need now. A bank lets some people buy things that they need now and lets other people buy investments that they'll need later. Now, there's two kinds of social inventions. I'm just going to make a quick clarification on that. Some social inventions are just agreements about how to behave. And we're going to drive on the right side as a social invention, and they just regulate existing behavior. People are driving already, but now we say, it's just safer you stay on the right, saves collisions, saves confusion. Other social inventions are also agreements, but they actually create behavior. Now, you didn't have people sitting across from each other pushing around pieces of wood for years before someone came along and said, I have rules for moving these pieces, and we'll call the movement chess. The rules of chess create the behavior we now call playing chess. So sometimes social inventions regulate, other times they actually create. And I would argue that most economic behavior, banks, corporations, and the like, those kinds of social inventions actually create behavior. They don't simply regulate it. Now, Western progress since medieval times through the three market-based economies we now call the agricultural, the industrial, and information economies, it has depended as much on social invention as it has on technological invention. The steam engine, the automobile, and the computer, undoubtedly crucial to progress. But what we notice less is that the nation-state, the bank, and the corporation have been just as instrumental. And those two have been invented. They didn't exist during medieval times. Now, while we're used to thinking about people who start and invent, if you will, new businesses as entrepreneurs, we don't use the entrepreneur term to describe people who start a new religion or a new government. We're happy to call Henry Ford or Bill Gates entrepreneurs, but if we define entrepreneurship as social invention, then I'd argue we'd need to include Martin Luther and Thomas Jefferson under that label as well. Social invention means entrepreneurship. Simple little definition that helps clarify a lot of what's happened in the past, and again, what I mean by an entrepreneurial economy. So let's get back to my prediction that the next economy will be an entrepreneurial economy. I think there's going to be two things that will be noticeably different. One, we're going to have a popularization of entrepreneurship in this century, just as we had a popularization of knowledge workers in the last century. There were knowledge workers that got hired during Edison's time, but the number of students aged 13 to 17, the people who were formally trained to become knowledge workers, rose dramatically between 1900 and 2000. In the U.S. in 1900, it was just a few percent of this age group who were in school, but by 2000, it was just a few percent who were not. Now think about what it will mean to have a growing percentage of people take on the role of entrepreneur, making a similar kind of rise, even if it's just from a fraction of the population right now to something in the tens of percent. Now, if you could imagine that kind of a rise in entrepreneurship, you'd probably be able to imagine my second important point. I think we're going to institutionalize social invention just like Edison helped to institutionalize technological invention. Right now, entrepreneurs come from outside the system. They start their own institutions. They start their own companies from outside. What I believe is going to happen is that this next shift, this popularization of entrepreneurship, where we make social invention as institutionalized as technological invention, the epicenter of that shift is going to be within the corporation, the next big institution to be transformed, in future videos on that. More employees will be more like entrepreneurs. So think about that. And while you are, think about what it would mean to have employees continually creating and recreating the business, playing social inventor, rather than someone who just takes on a role or a job already defined for her or for him. And think about what it means to create and recreate government, schools, and nonprofits, not just business, so that it is normal people who define these institutions rather than get defined by them. Now, obviously, a wild increase in the number of folks acting like entrepreneurs has the potential to create huge disruption and a huge gain of prosperity, just like we saw in the first three previous economies. But of all those possibilities, I think what most intrigues me is the potential for individuals to define institutions rather than be defined by them. There was a time in history when technological invention was rare and it was wildly disruptive when it happened. Now it's normal. You were born into a time when communities still found social invention disruptive. But what if that changes? Again, it gets to the very definition of self. Throughout history, we've judged the individual by whether they're a good Christian or a good student or a good employee or a good citizen. But what about a world where individuals judge and get to create and recreate churches, schools, governments, and corporations? What about judging our institutions by their ability to realize our potential, not our ability to realize their potential. Now, this kind of thing, this kind of a shift from the institution to the individual has happened a few times in history, but it's always looked like it's always been labeled revolution. What if instead it just looked like another year? Stay tuned. I'm planning more of these videos. Meanwhile, you can pick up the book, The Fourth Economy, Inventing Western Civilization, at Amazon for Kindle or for paperback, or at Barnes & Noble for Nook. Thanks for watching. Stay tuned.